Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
As you may know, this morning the Supreme Court issued its 5-4 ruling on the marriage case. And this is a good example, I think, of 5 unelected justices overturning the will of, 41 million people who voted to define marriage as a union between one man and one woman. Of course, before that, we saw about 24 unelected judges overturning the express will of elections in about 20 different states. But here, the ratio is incredible. Even if you add up the people that actually voted to actually have same-sex marriage in their own state, that's about 3 million compared to 41 million. It's kind of a 12-to-1 ratio, so certainly some great concern. We're going to hear today from Gary Bauer and Michael Ferris and Tony Perkins. Of course, around the round table, we have Penna, Dexter, and Debbie Georgatos. And since yesterday I was so critical of Chief Justice John Roberts on the Obamacare subsidies case, how about I quote from him today that I agreed with? This court is not a legislature. Whether same-sex marriage is a good idea should be of no concern to us. A little bit later he said, but do not celebrate the Constitution. It had nothing to do with it. Penna, Dexter?
Yeah, before saying not to celebrate the Constitution, he said, if you really like this decision, go ahead and celebrate, but don't celebrate the Constitution. And I guess we're not celebrating today around the round table. We now have a guest who's going to weigh in, Gary Bauer, president of American Values, no stranger to Point of View. And Gary, this wasn't unexpected, but in a sense, when you lived through it, especially if you care as much as all of us do around the table, and I know you do, it's hard. But I guess if we look to the future, we're really looking to more battle. It's not settled, is it?
No, it's not settled. I must admit, when I heard you, I've read the decision too, and I read yesterday's decision where Justice Roberts was, I thought yesterday, on the wrong side. I'm sitting here feeling like one of the things I should do next week is arrange a lunch meeting so that I can put Justice Roberts and Justice Roberts together at the same table, so they
let them argue with each other.
Yes, whether the court is a legislature or is not a legislature. But at any rate, no. Look, this is terrible, and I've already gotten some emails today, and I suspect some of your listeners may share these sentiments. I've gotten some emails today, and even a few yesterday after the Obamacare case, where good people said to me, Gary, I'm sorry, I don't want to offend you, but I'm done. Take me off the list. Not going to be making any more contributions. The country's lost. Forget about it. Going back into our church and pray. Well, look, I understand the sentiment, but it's as wrong as the court's decision. As bad as this is, you ain't seen bad. If men and women of faith learn from this decision that all is lost and there's nothing we can do, because clearly, as you all have already hinted at, the next step here, and it may have been really the only step that mattered, is whether or not the new right to same-sex marriage is going to be used as a battering ram to shrink into unrecognizability the free exercise of religion right that the whole country was built on. That attack on religious liberty is already happening, and today will accelerate it.
Well, in the actual opinion, there is a religious exclusion, and 9-0, the justices signed on to it, but it remains to be seen whether or not this will be enforced. It's going to be a battle. And that's why it makes me sad, Gary, to hear that people are dropping out, some of your supporters, because they're tired of it. Hey, this is not a time, if you're a believing saint out there, ladies and gentlemen, this is not the time to drop out. God needs all hands on deck, doesn't he, Gary?
Yes, absolutely. And there's many reasons that we're losing, and not all of which we understand, I suspect. But one of them that I think has always been clear is that the secular left just won't take no for an answer. When they lose, they pick themselves up and they're right back in the arena within hours or days, and they count on exhaustion on our part, and I'm sure a lot of our folks do feel exhausted, particularly when these punches are coming so rapidly. But it would be a terrible mistake. I mean, Jim Dobson and I wrote in Children at Risk years ago that if you leave the public square, that your place in the public square will be taken by people that have quite a different view of what America is about. And as bad as this is, I repeat, it's only a small taste of what could happen if our side goes into some sort of hibernation because this came out badly.
Hi, Gary. This is Debbie Georgatos. I was thinking also about how the court seems in some of the language to be reflecting on or taking courage and strength out of their argument that there is growing public support for same-sex marriage, which shouldn't have any play in the decision about the Constitution. But it sounds like they're acknowledging, well, the people are with us, let's just go with the flow, which ties back to what you're saying. It makes it incumbent on Christians and believers of all faiths who support traditional marriage to keep that in the public conversation, the public eye, because the quieter we get, the more the sentiment or the appearance grows that the sentiment is overwhelmingly in support of same-sex marriage. The part of the fight is in the American conversation every day.
Yeah, I'm not sure I can say anything to improve on that. That's a great analysis. You're absolutely right. Look, by the way, if the country had shifted so overwhelmingly on same-sex marriage as the other side has claimed, the simple answer in this court case would have been to say, well, look, the public sentiment has changed. Let the constitutional republic work its will. Let the voters go back to the polls in these various states and show that they've changed their minds. And the vote that they might have taken 3 years ago or 5 years ago, they no longer believe. The other side has never been willing to support referenda on the issue, and they haven't supported it now, because I think they know that the polling, that the odds are strong that the polling is very distorted, because people literally are afraid that if they tell a stranger at their door or at the other end of the phone who says he's a pollster, that if they give the wrong answer on this, they might lose their job, their name might be printed in some public document, they might be harassed. I mean, we see what's happened to businessmen, to small business owners, to Christian leaders that have dared to speak out even before today's decision against same-sex marriage. They are literally put in the well, not literally, but they're run through the coals. They're made to look as if they are the equivalent of the Ku Klux Klan, all because they are defending the traditional definition of marriage being the union of one man and one woman.
Gary Bauer, we got to stop meeting like this. But it always is great to get your perspective. I know you're headed on to some other interviews, and I appreciate you giving us some time today here on Point of View.
My pleasure as always, to be with you. But not a happy day. And look, everybody, when you lose something, you got a right to lick your wounds. We should lick our wounds. But we're people of faith. We need to get back and fight the good fight.
We'll talk a little bit more about the actual case and how the justices came to this conclusion right after these messages.
The Point of View Commentary with Kerby Anderson.
If you've been to a movie recently, you probably were watching a remake or a sequel like Jurassic World or Mad Max. We're in the midst of nearly 30 movies that could be described as remakes or sequels. There are more to come. And don't forget the franchise operations like James Bond, Mission Impossible, X-Men, and Hunger Games. Charlie Jane Anders asks, why does Hollywood keep rebooting the same movie properties over and over again? It's not just because studios want fans of those franchises to be happy. It's because the movie business is about supply and demand. She quotes from Scott Feinberg, who reminds us that the film business, like any other, operates in a market of supply and demand. So while we critics often complain about the supply side, we have to consider the demand. Derek Thompson, writing in The Atlantic, provides a history lesson. He says in 1950, movies were the third largest retail business in America after grocery stores and cars. In the 1950s, 60% of the country went to a cinema each week. That was an audience bigger than today's Super Bowl. Americans used to buy 20 or 30 tickets. Today they buy about 4. Back then, 6 major studios dominated the landscape. They could do basically whatever they wanted and could be sure of making money. They also owned their own theater chains and controlled the means and distribution of their cinematic product. Today, a film producer can no longer guarantee a weekly audience. Thompson concludes that 60 years ago, audiences went to movies reflexively. Now we go to movies mostly to see things we recognize, actors, stories, and crusaders wearing costumes. We're certain to see more of Iron Man, Spider-Man, X-Men, and all the Avengers. I think this opens the door for smaller creative film producers, including Christian film producers, to break out of the mold and tell interesting and inspiring stories that will draw people to the theater or to the DVDs they produce. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Weekend edition, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212, talking about the Supreme Court decision today, 5-4 on the issue of same-sex marriage. A little bit later, maybe in the second hour, we'll get back to some of the conversation we had yesterday. That was the 6-3 decision on the issue of the Affordable Care Act. But we have around the round table today, Penna, Dexter, and Debbie Georgatos. Let me put a couple of things on the table and get your comments. Gary Bauer raised the question, wouldn't it have been possible for the court to have simply said, we're not going to deal with this, we'll let it go through the legislative process? And that, although was a theoretical possibility, there was, of course, the difficulty of the fact that a lot of people had been married, and then would they be unmarried or something like that? But the court really addressed it. They said when the Constitution contemplates that democracy is the appropriate process for change, individuals who are harmed need not await legislative action before asserting a fundamental right. That's the point. Gary Bauer sort of alluded to that. Kelly Shackelford, Penna, has talked about this a lot because they use the word fundamental right. So now the right to marriage is right up there with the right to free speech, the right to assembly. Well, you can't, quote, then allow the legislative process to take place if that's a fundamental right. So that's why they have actually said now that states will be required to accept not only the marriages within their state, but to recognize same-sex marriages validly performed out of state. That's one of the quotes from there. So now you can see there is going to be a whole lot more litigation because it's now a fundamental right.
Yeah, Scalia's dissent said that this decision was a threat to democracy, and it is. It basically disenfranchised 50 million voters, the people that voted for marriage in their states. And so we have that now. And, we do have, we place a lot of stock in the decisions by our Supreme Court. We move forward according to those decisions. Most of the time it sort of settles the matter in many cases. But with Roe versus Wade, it didn't settle the matter. It launched the pro-life movement that's existed, that's defined the right to life, that has been successful in moving public opinion. And that's the same thing that's happening here, because people of faith, they bow to a higher God than government. And so they're not going to change their spiritual and biblical opinions. They're not going to change their doctrine because of the Supreme Court. So what they've done is they've launched now, we have a pro-life movement. There's going to be, actually the pro-marriage movement has already been launched, but it will be accelerated now.
You mentioned that about Roe versus Wade. In a commentary a while back, I talked about the fact that this has been called the possible Roe versus Wade of marriage, but there's a real difference. Back in 1973, when you had Roe versus Wade on abortion, nobody had really voted on that. It was really not top of the mind for very many individuals. We have 41 million Americans who have voted to define marriage as between one man and one woman. As Gary Bauer said, maybe a few of those have changed their mind. I don't think so. As a matter of fact, there may be some evidence that a lot more than 41 million than those that voted also believe that as well. And so this is a little different, I would think, because in this case, the court is jumping in and completely disavowing the vote of 41 million individuals. And I suspect, I'm already starting to see phone calls coming in, there are going to be some people say, well, what good does it do for me to vote if the Supreme Court can overturn something I voted on in my own state referendum?
One thing states can do, and we're here in Texas doing the show today, and the Governor Abbott, who's our governor in Texas, has already issued a statement talking about the Texas response. And one distinction I want to mention between the abortion and the marriage thing is, in the abortion case, whatever the court ruled, you individually, each person did not have to change their behavior. You didn't have to be told you must have an abortion or you must, support an abortion doctor. But in marriage, the whole marriage issue touches so many individuals and churches where it's actually going to be forced on you, your church, your bakery, your floral business. It's a real direct rub between this new right the court has defined and the rights that already exist in states and are enshrined, in fact, in the Constitution, the rights of association and religion and free speech. So it's a very direct rub between two rights, much more a harsh conflict than with abortion. And when Governor Abbott, what he's basically saying is, Texas in 2005 voted, it's in our Constitution, that marriage is a man and a woman in Texas. And so he's saying he's going to do everything he can to protect Texas citizens for their right to stand for what they believe in with respect to marriage based on their genuinely held religious beliefs. So there's pushback already coming from him.
He was talking about the fact, of course, we have the First Amendment guarantees free exercise of religion. Of course, he mentioned the Texas Constitution, but also the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. And then now, of course, in Texas, they also have the Pastor Protection Act. That brings us back to a point, Penna, that you brought to my attention. Even though you had 5 justices vote to actually overturn these state laws and these state constitutional amendments defining marriage as one man and one woman, you have a 9-0 vote on this particular case. What is that?
Here's what it says in the opinion. It's written by Kennedy. The whole opinion in this clause is written by him. It must be emphasized that religions and those who adhere to religious doctrines may continue to advocate with utmost sincere conviction that, I'm still reading this thing, the precepts of same-sex marriage should not be condoned. Mm-hmm. And so that is, it's going to be litigated. There's going to be, as we've discussed before the program, they will push the envelope in every direction. They are celebrating today. This is a day that's already, we're in Gay History Month or whatever. We're in Gay Pride Month. There's gay pride parades that were already planned. So this decision was announced today, sort of. Normally decisions aren't even announced on a Friday. And so, there's an overwhelming agenda, of course, to push this on us. But this clause was put in there, and I think it's, in a way, it's something for religious liberty attorneys to hold on to. We can talk to the folks at Liberty perhaps next week, because they'll tell us, what are their plans and how will they defend this part of the decision.
I haven't had the chance to read the decision. I can't wait to do it. But the language you were just reading, it sounds like what they're saying is that religious liberty, people who embrace religious liberty have the right to advocate. So maybe that just means that you get to say in church on Sunday morning during your sermon, by the way, marriage is a man and a woman. It doesn't actually sound like it's particularly broad with respect to, does it mean, if you're a baker, you don't have to bake a cake for a wedding? Does it mean if you're a church, you can take an entire stance on not permitting gay marriages? It's obviously, it's not a throwaway sentence, but it is not particularly defined. And therefore, I think with the fact that the opinion is giving a constitutional right to same-sex marriage, there's not going to be a lot of weight put on that versus the right to marry, I'm afraid. It's a little bit of a signal. We know you guys are upset about this. In fact, the same kind of language came on President Obama today. It was kind of like, we know you're upset, and I know people have religious beliefs, and I get it, but there was no, therefore, out of it.
Yeah, certainly the right to marry. I mean, that's what this decision is about. But we also know that the whole gay agenda has been used against Christians operating businesses, and we're afraid it's going to be used against pastors, and adoption being Catholic adoption houses saying that we will not adopt out to same-sex couples, all that type of activity. And so, as we've looked toward this case, and we've known probably that the court would rule this way, there's been an attempt to get some religious liberty protections in there. How strong are they? Will they be enforced? They'll probably be litigated. What I guess the point here is that Christians are still going to have a big, big role to play. We shouldn't sit back. We should be actually in the battle and in the fight even more than ever. Unfortunately, we can't be comfortable in the culture. We are not, less and less, I think, we're a comfortable religion in the culture. We're now going to be a peculiar people.
Yeah, I can't think of the biblical passage, but, it's stepping outside of the, I can't think of it, so I'll look it up in the break and come back to that. But the passage about you have to kind of step outside of society and stand separate for what you believe in.
Be in the world and not of the world.
There you
Certainly
go.
That's part of it. And we see that in the Gospel of John. But we also, again, we are a peculiar people because the Bible talks about that as well. And, again, even if this was an ironclad protection, I still sometimes think about what a gay agenda activist would want to do. And they would say, well, even if I lose in the higher court, I'll still sue some pastor. I'll still continue to force individuals that are running various shops to capitulate. And even if I lose in the higher court, it's just the intimidation factor that will work only so well. And that's, I think, the big challenge I think the church is going to have to deal with in the future. When the pressure is on, how many people really in their core believe this? And I can see we have all sorts of phone calls here wanting to know about the case, wanting to know how to encourage people to stay in the fight, some wanting to know how we can get rid of some of these people making those decisions. And we will get to those phone calls, but we're privileged after the break to have Michael Ferris with us for just a few minutes. He has some comments as well. And we've heard from Gary Bauer. We're going to hear from Michael Ferris, and we're going to hear from you. But before the end of the program, we'll also have a chance to hear from Tony Perkins. Lots to cover. We recognize that. And if you have ever wondered why we are calling you to pray for America, this is a very good reason to do so. As a matter of fact, if you go to our Pray for America section, you'll see a very good video by Jack Graham. We'll be back right after this.
When you hear about a child forced into the sex trade, it should make your blood boil. Someone needs to do something. Noel Boucher became that someone, leading a ministry called Pure Hope, promoting sexual purity and fighting sex trafficking. And it all began as his parents listened to Point of View.
Even when I was a young child, and even when that content was almost in the background, definitely shaped how I thought about my faith and what the Lord expected of me and the community that He would provide around me.
Kerby has met numerous young people in recent days who are on the front lines of the faith because God uses Point of View. Your support today will raise up another generation to impact lives. Listen, right now, every dollar you give will be matched, doubled. Please give online at pointofview.net. pointofview.net, or mail your donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221, or call 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
Many times, people who are older than me say they have given up hope on America. They don't believe that we can come back from the changes and challenges. The widespread promotion of anti-Christian beliefs is sweeping into courtrooms, schools, newsrooms, and homes. They're pushing to be mainstream and claiming the Bible and Christian beliefs are a thing of the past, or worse, bigoted. It is easy for the older generation to give up when America is so different now from the one they grew up with. But if you give up, where does that leave my generation and the ones behind me? I believe that we should stand and pray. The only one who can fix us and make America a shining light again is God. He promised his plans are to prosper his people and give us a hope and a future. Prayer is the best way we can act on the hope for a future. James wrote, "The fervent prayer of a righteous man avails much." I still believe that. If you believe God will shape the future by the prayers of his people, you can sign up to be a part of the Pray for America campaign at pointofview.net/pray.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
As you well know, we're talking about this decision coming down from the Supreme Court 5-4 on the issue of marriage. In studio with me, Penna, Dexter, Debbie Georgatos. It is our weekend edition. And we now go to Michael Ferris for just a few minutes, and he is the Chancellor of the Patrick Henry College, Chairman of the Homeschool Legal Defense Association, and he said earlier today that the court's decision in the marriage case directly overrides the popular vote of 32 states, which put traditional marriage provisions into their state constitutions. And, of course, it was changed by 5 justices. Penna?
Michael, you've been in this battle a long time, and I know that a lot of us pretty much expected this decision, but it's a little different going through it and actually having it be a reality. How are you feeling today?
Well, I frankly am feeling mad and ready to go fight. It's time to say that we will not put up with the Supreme Court running our lives in this way. I mean, the substance of the marriage decision itself is incredibly important, and it will affect the fabric of our society. But we have to have the same spirit that the other side would have today if they lost. If they lost today, they would say, we're going to redouble our efforts, and we're going to go try a strategy that will win the next round. And unfortunately, the next round is basically to play for all the marbles. I think we have to take away the power of the Supreme Court to make these kinds of decisions without any checks and balances. That's the battleground where we can and must win.
Something I read today said now we have 3 legislative branches of government. We've got Obama who makes law. We've got, of course, the Congress and the Supreme Court, especially these 2 major decisions. How do you do that? What would be your prescription for taking some of that power away from the court?
I would go back to Article 1, Section 1, where only Congress can make law. I would take it away from the court and the president as well, and his, various secretaries and agencies. The way you could do it with the court is to put a political check on them. The court has said about 24 times that there's no realistic check on their power other than their own internal sense of self-restraint. So having, for example, the ground of refusing to follow the original meaning of the Constitution as a grounds for impeachment, that would be a good start. Giving the states the power to do the impeachment would be a better add-on. Giving the states by a supermajority, perhaps 30 states, to vacate a Supreme Court decision. Giving the states the ability to appoint the Supreme Court justices. Actually, that's my favorite. There are international European courts where they have multiple nations that participate together, and every government appoints one judge. And there's no reason that we can't do the Supreme Court the same way, where every state could decide whatever method they want to appoint their Supreme Court justice who serves for an 8-year term, let's say, and then they're gone. Getting the appointment power, getting the Supreme Court out of the control of Washington, D.C., I think is essential. And so there's a variety of things we can talk about how what could be done, but the real question is how do we get that done? And I think the only way to do that is through the Convention of the States process.
What about the immediate reaction? I mean, you're talking about states. There are 16 states who are not. We don't have gay marriage in Texas, for instance, because we have never been forced to by the courts, like most of them. So, what should these states do now?
The answer is that's going to change virtually tomorrow. Actually, there's a couple of days that will transpire. The Supreme Court's got to issue another round of papers called the formal mandate and so on. But that's a matter of days, not weeks. And so as soon as that mandate comes down, there will be motions and cases filed in Texas and every one of the other states. And so it's over. Now, unless the governor of the state was willing to basically engage in civil disobedience, which would be brave, but it will boil down to basically a shooting war. And I would rather try the Article 5 process rather than calling out the National Guard to go to war against the U.S. Army, which is where the other train leads.
Wow.
Debbie, any comments?
I just find this so, kind of almost otherworldly or something. We're having this case because what you're describing, I don't think is actually that far-fetched in America anymore. I think a governor, for example, Governor Abbott, he just may say, we're not doing it. I don't know that he would want to follow the sword over this case, but the growing federal power, the Supreme Court's just seemingly cavalier dismissal of the will of the people and failure to follow the Constitution in very clear cases, I don't know if we aren't close to that idea anywhere, or maybe Governor Abbott will do that. He certainly issued a statement today in Texas saying that he was going to protect the right of Texas citizens to not have their religious liberty infringed. So that's going to butt up against what the court's trying to say.
Well, I'm glad to hear him say that. And I supported Governor Abbott, from the outside, but he's a good man, and he's saying that's a positive statement to say, because the religious freedom question is yet to be fought. That's the next shoe to drop, and where they're going to try to coerce people on a very basic level. For example, I'm an ordained Baptist pastor, as well as a lawyer, kind of my own violation of church and state rules. But I'm licensed by the state of Virginia to perform marriages. If somebody comes to me, as probably somebody will now, and asks me to perform a same-sex ceremony, I'll say, no, I won't do that. And they'll go to the governing officials of Virginia that control the licensing and say, revoke Mike Ferris's license to perform marriages. And given the governor of Virginia, he'll do it. That will be a done deal if that scenario plays out in Virginia. The ability of a pastor, a church, a homeschool support group, a Christian college, a Christian school, every institution is going to be challenged. And for Greg Abbott to say, I'm going to stand up for religious liberty to prohibit people from being personally coerced to be involved in same-sex marriages, that's a good and important thing. But it's not the same thing as saying Texas won't issue marriage licenses to same-sex couples. What I would do, I don't know that this could be done, but at least it's an idea. I would say, look if the federal government wants to order marriage licenses, fine. You order marriage licenses. We're not going to issue them. But if you want to do it, fine. You can issue marriage licenses, and you can get married in Texas under a federal license. We refuse to do it under our state licensing. It violates our conscience.
Michael, I just want to go back and talk about the long-term solutions that you were mentioning earlier in our interview. How long would it take, for instance, to bring some of this power back to the states through the Article 5 convention?
We could have it done a year from today, if the states would cooperate, and the people that are supposedly on our side generally would stop being silly about the historical nonsense of a runaway convention. This has been passed in 4 states completely: Alabama, Georgia, Florida, and Alaska. We had it through 11 other states this year in just one house. And so if we could get all those states to come around and another 20 or about 20 to join them, we're there. And then that could be done by about April of next year, and next summer we could be holding the convention, and by a year from there you could have them ratified. So this all could be done open and closed in the space of 2 years.
Are you speaking about those states you just mentioned in this Article 5 convention, the Article 5 convention being particularly tied to these ideas you were just speaking about? That because there's a lot of talk about Article 5 conventions on a wide range of issues, but the one you're talking about is actually about changing the power of the Supreme Court? There are 3 major efforts to call an Article 5 convention. One is to just call for a balanced budget. The second, and then there's a couple of variants of how to do that one, but that's the topic. There's one on the left where they want to reverse Citizens United, and I have nothing to do with those people. That's not something I support. But then there's the one that I'm the national director of, and that's the Convention of States Project. And that one calls for 3 things. It impose fiscal restraints on the federal government, limit the power and jurisdiction of the federal government, and impose term limits on federal officials. And so the Supreme Court is a part of what we're trying to accomplish. So limits on the Supreme Court. We track almost identically to Mark Levin's book, the Liberty Amendments.
although his precise amendments would not be the only thing we can consider. But those are the ideas that are similar.
We're going to take a break. Michael Farris, thanks for being with us.
Many times, people who are older than me say they have given up hope on America. They don't believe that we can come back from the changes and challenges. The widespread promotion of anti-Christian beliefs is sweeping into courtrooms, schools, newsrooms, and homes. They're pushing to be mainstream and claiming the Bible and Christian beliefs are a thing of the past, or worse, bigoted. It is easy for the older generation to give up when America is so different now from the one they grew up with. But if you give up, where does that leave my generation and the ones behind me? I believe that we should stand and pray. The only one who can fix us and make America a shining light again is God. He promised his plans are to prosper his people and give us a hope and a future. Prayer is the best way we can act on the hope for a future. James wrote, "The fervent prayer of a righteous man avails much." I still believe that. If you believe God will shape the future by the prayers of his people, you can sign up to be a part of the Pray for America campaign at pointofview.net/pray.
More centralized insurers can survive financially. There's another consolidation frenzy. Hospitals, doctors, and other providers are also uniting. Again, quoting the Wall Street Journal, hospital mergers have climbed every year since 2009, and hospitals are absorbing physician groups, with doctors increasingly becoming salaried workers at hospitals. Regional hospital megasystems are beginning to dominate certain markets. This is turning out to be more about maximizing revenues than increasing efficiency and improving outcomes. The journal admits that healthcare has been consolidating since the 90s, but under current law, the trend has accelerated. The good news is technological and biological discoveries continue at a rapid pace, but without a healthy set of companies with the incentive to finance and deliver these new products into the system and to patients, this innovation will fall off. Small, hungry companies with optimistic investors would find profitable ways to get new and better healthcare to patients and make a profit doing it. But conglomerates, largely dependent on one client, the federal government, will act in risk-averse ways to protect their bottom lines. Here's the journal's ominous conclusion. 5 years into the glories of healthcare reform, the same antiquated incumbents dominate as they did before, only with less accountability to patients. It remains to be seen what kind of blow the Supreme Court's ruling regarding federal subsidies will deal to the healthcare system. But we ought to use this opportunity to create something that employs state innovation and free markets before we devolve into a single healthcare behemoth controlled by the federal government. It's really now or never. For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Weekend edition, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Penna Dexter, Debbie Georgatos, and one of the things Michael Farris said in his press release is why do we do this? Why do we allow unelected judges to make political decisions, including the most important decisions of our era? Abortion and now same-sex marriage have both ripped our country apart. Last night I saw a Facebook post by Professor Robert George at Princeton, and he was saying, isn't this just a little bit bizarre? We're sitting here waiting for the decision coming down from 5 justices on the issue of marriage that has been defined for millennia, and we sit around here waiting for that decision. And so that's one of the reasons why everybody from Gary Bauer to Michael Farris, and I'm sure we have Tony Perkins on a little bit later, saying we got to do something.
Yeah. I mean, it was interesting to me that Kennedy, of course, we kind of expected Kennedy to write it because he's had such an interest in this issue. And that's kind of how it comes down sometimes. He's writing it. He's the swing. He's kind of all over the map sometimes, and we're all waiting for this, like this is going to totally change everything. But it really does in one sense, because now we go forward, and we know that we go forward having to battle the establishment because they're on the other side on something as important as marriage.
I love the picture of foreign countries looking. They used to have, a mysterious group of leaders and go in dark room and make rulings. And we think we're so advanced in America. And we have this wonderful structure in the Constitution and a rule of law and an orderly process. But at the end of the day, it is, again, as you're saying, deferring to 9 people who get to wear black robes. And they're also people who were chosen in oftentimes very bizarre hearings in Congress and deal cutting to let which person on the court. I mean, it isn't though they're just past the most test of most wisdom and faithful to the Constitution test at all. In fact, there was one quote I want to keep talking about that it was Justice Roberts said when he on his confirmation hearing. He said they asked about his bias. Yeah. He said, you know what? I just call balls or strikes.
I'm an
umpire. And you know what? I'd love to make that analogy about his decision in Obamacare. What he decided in Obamacare is, which either is like, we'll change the rules, you get it to third base, we'll count it as a run, or even more, just stop having games. We'll just let you know who won. He's completely abandoned that role he claimed he would hold in the hearings, which makes you really suspect what you don't really hear what many of these justices really believe in their hearts when they're having their hearings. So at the end of the day, they're just mere mortals.
Yes. Well, again, if you want to keep the baseball analogy going a little bit longer, instead of being the umpire behind the plate calling balls and strikes, he actually went out on the field and became the 10th man.
There you go.
Let's take some phone calls along the way as well. And I think this question is one that maybe Debbie can address. Bill in Georgia on the Good News Network. What's your question?
Yeah, Kerby, I want to thank you. It's more of a comment and a question. Thank you and the panel for all that you do there with your ministry. I wanted to comment regarding the strategy against judicial advocacy, and Mr. Ferris covered it a little bit. But when you're talking about, I don't know how I'm going to keep a straight face telling my friends and family members about their responsibility to vote. I mean, you are talking about overwhelming margins in Mississippi, Oklahoma, and your numbers, 41 to 3 million.
Yep.
And then it gets just kind of tossed to the side, and it is indeed a severe threat to democracy. And I just want to hear the panel talk more or expand on what Mr. Ferris was saying about strategies, real strategies. And I can tell my family and friends, I know disengagement is not the answer. I understand that. But what about other ideas?
Sure. Twofold. First of all, when people say, should I just give up? You had a good illustration that we haven't said on the air, and I'd love to hear it.
I'm sorry, what was that?
Plessy versus Ferguson.
Oh, yeah. The Supreme Court decided many years ago in Plessy versus Ferguson that separate but equal was fine, that you could have segregated schools, and the people who advocated for years and years to try to get to the court and say, hey, come on, we want equality. And the court said, no, we don't need that. But the court had to reverse that years later in Brown versus Board of Education and say, no, actually, separate but equal is inherently unequal. It took pressure, even when the Supreme Court made a bad decision, it took pressure by people who are on the correct side of the issue to finally get around to the right thing. And I actually think in this case, even though it's very difficult to imagine how to unwind this, I think the idea that at the very least, the decision about marriage belongs in the states is something that everyone who believes it needs to push and push and push. And to your other point, if I may, about how what good does it do to vote? The judicial process is slow, and the selection of federal court judges happens, and the Congress has to confirm, the Senate has to confirm them, and all that process takes time, and so it can seem like, gosh, I voted, look what happened the very next session. But the truth is, if we had had a Republican president over a conservative, I don't mean to be just partisan, but a conservative president, a pro-constitutional president, you would have different appointments to the Supreme Court. And this upcoming election, we're going to have a choice between a very liberal person and a more conservative one. And that alone, the power that president may have to appoint Supreme Court justices all by itself matters a lot. And you can see it in the outcome. Not that every conservative president who's appointed someone has chosen wisely, because we have some that wandered off the reservation. But the power of selecting Supreme Court justices is huge, and the president has to be the one to nominate them. So nominating or choosing a president wisely is very important. And there were many, many conservatives who stayed home in the last several election cycles for whatever reasons they would give. And whatever your reason was, it wasn't good enough.
Would a President Hillary Clinton appoint a Supreme Court Justice Eric Holder, or even more, a Supreme Court Justice Barack Obama, and then recognize that would be very difficult for people to actually fight against because of all of that? I mean, you have a very significant difference. Now, let's be fair. Yesterday, we're talking about the decision that was rendered by Justice John Roberts, who was a Bush appointee. Today we're talking about Justice Anthony Kennedy, who was a Reagan appointee. So sometimes the Republican presidents haven't always put people on the court that we agree with either.
They haven't, and I like to say, though, when you have a more liberal president, Democrat president, their nominees to the court never somehow make it over to the middle or the right. It's only the ones that are supposed to be conservative, and they are, at the end of the day, human beings subjected to the pressures of common societal perceptions of what's popular and what's viewed as right. And I think this decision on marriage was largely swayed by the perception that the American public is now behind same-sex marriage, so why not just find a way to make it constitutional?
They went from all sides. This movement is brilliant, and they've been working this for decades. But taking the really the situation out of the hands of the people and the legislatures, forcing it on 37 states through the courts, and then going in with their opinion polls. And as we've said, it's really hard to answer a poll. You really sound like a bigot when you start talking about marriage, especially the way they ask the questions. So they brought the opinion polls in, and the timing was, they felt right because they got over a majority now saying that, you shouldn't take the right to marry away from gays. And that's really the way they asked the question. Yeah. And so, all their pieces have come together right now, and it feels really bad. I mean, I think it just feels like a major defeat. It feels like, okay, we're just changed as a country now. And the only way we will be changed, though, is if people don't stay involved and still stand up and defend our religious liberties right now, to believe what God says about marriage, and then to move forward and to convince the culture now that marriage is still a good thing for our society.
And again, a lot of that needs to take place in the popular culture, not just politically. Mm-hmm. John Stonestreet always reminds us that after, in the situation, you had 20 different states vote to establish marriage as one man and one woman. On the Larry King show, there was a gay activist, and they said, "Are you discouraged?" He says, really not at all, because the number one show is Will and Grace. And we're going to win this, and because he understood that popular culture is upstream from politics. Politics is downstream. And so this is conversations around the water cooler. These are conversations over the backyard fence. These are the kind of creative things that we need to do to make a difference. We encourage you to pray for America. We also encourage you to visit our website, pointofview.net. This is an opportunity for you to support our ministry. We'll be back with more right after this.
Noel Boucher rescues people. The ministry he leads, Pure Hope, reaches those trapped in sex trafficking and helps set them free. Noel has listened to Point of View since he was a child, and that enables him to cut through the competing stories that try to give meaning to our times and to see God's story for his own life.
We have to understand God's narrative and our role in that. And of course, Christian radio, and specifically Point of View, is touching thousands and millions of lives across the world and equipping people to walk in that worldview.
Your gift to Point of View can make an impact for generations. And hear this, we all want to give generously. And right now, at the end of our fiscal year, no matter what your gift, $25 or $5,000, it will be doubled by a generous matching gift from ministry friends. So give now, online at pointofview.net. Pointofview.net. Mail your donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221, or call 800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just thank God for y'all. I listen to you every day, truly. I wanted to thank y'all for everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love you guys and appreciate you so much.
God bless you, Kerby, for keeping this show so on track and for the decades of wonderful help to this nation that Point of View has been. We're all big fans of your work, and we pray that God will just prosper it.
As a Christian, over the years that I've followed this program, I am constantly challenged to be on guard and to evaluate what's going on. And if for no other reason, to protect the caliber and the truth of your programming, I need to participate and to back your program financially to ensure that the truth stays out there for people to hear, to view, and to be a part of.
This is Point of View Radio.
Many times, people who are older than me say they have given up hope on America. They don't believe that we can come back from the changes and challenges. The widespread promotion of anti-Christian beliefs is sweeping into courtrooms, schools, newsrooms, and homes. They're pushing to be mainstream and claiming the Bible and Christian beliefs are a thing of the past, or worse, bigoted. It is easy for the older generation to give up when America is so different now from the one they grew up with. But if you give up, where does that leave my generation and the ones behind me? I believe that we should stand and pray. The only one who can fix us and make America a shining light again is God. He promised his plans are to prosper his people and give us a hope and a future. Prayer is the best way we can act on the hope for a future. James wrote, "The fervent prayer of a righteous man avails much." I still believe that. If you believe God will shape the future by the prayers of his people, you can sign up to be a part of the Pray for America campaign at pointofview.net/pray.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour today, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Debbie Georgatos with us, Penna, Dexter, and I might just mention we have a couple of things that we've posted. First of all, we have the opinions of the same-sex marriage case. We also have the opinion from Obamacare yesterday, the Affordable Care Act. And also I've posted one which we'll get to a little bit later when we talk about that issue of Obamacare and the subsidies, because now there's a bill that is in Congress which would force the Supreme Court to actually enroll in Obamacare. Okay, you passed it, you got to live under it. So we'll talk about that in just a minute. But let me take some phone calls before we get into that. And again, if you have any comments or questions, 1-800-351-1212. Let's head out to North Carolina first. And David, you're on the program. What would you like to add to the conversation?
Well, it's real simple there. What part of thou shalt and thou shalt not do they people not understand that are these unelected officials we have? In other words, what right have they got to come here and force us? They take us and they make us accept things like the same-sex marriage, where in the Bible told us in God's Word, and this is God's roadmap. This is all we've got to go by. Why do we have to tolerate stuff like this? Why can't we not get together and vote these unelected officials out of office? They're not voted in to start with. Why can't we come up with some kind of a judicial thing to make it against the law for them to be even in that kind of dealings to make us...
Well, let's talk about that around the round table here for just a minute. Okay, I mean, we've heard a little bit from Michael Ferris, but the Constitution does provide some options. Debbie, I'll come to you first, but there is this idea of limiting appellate jurisdiction. There is impeachment. So if people really do get upset and say, wait a minute, this has gone too far. These are individuals who were not elected. They're unelected. But are there remedies that individuals might want to pursue, that Congress might want to pursue, even before we talk about amending the Constitution?
You know, there are. I think that one little caveat is the Supreme Court does issue decisions every year that either, generally speaking, liberals don't like or conservatives don't like. So you always have to really step back and say, am I insisting on a principle? Or am I just trying to retaliate on a particular decision I don't like? Because we on the right, in my view, tend to be the more geared toward principle and rule of law and things that are consistent. So I think that's just an important caveat. I love the idea of limiting appellate jurisdiction in the Congress, United States Congress, taking that responsibility to say, we are going to, for example, say there will be no jurisdiction in federal courts to discuss, or appellate jurisdiction to discuss marriage. Marriage is left to the states. And then I don't know how that would all work out, and I'm not as familiar with these options, but I love the idea of Congress stepping in, because really Congress more directly reflects the will of the people. It is the elected officials. As everybody knows, we have no ability to control who sits in any of the federal district courts, appellate courts, or Supreme Court, except by virtue of whom we elect to Congress, to the Senate.
Yeah, of course, that also says how important the next election is, but also if you say, well, they don't ever do that. Well, actually, Senator Harry Reid actually limited the appellate jurisdiction of a particular court not so long ago. So it has been used, but not in a case as large as this. Penna, what are your thoughts?
You know, as mentioned in many of the articles about this decision, this has been a battle that's been going on for maybe 10 or 20 years. And back in the early, maybe 2003 or so, we were talking about a federal marriage amendment. Do you remember that? Mm-hmm. And a lot of conservatives were trying to get something passed by the Congress to say marriage is between a man and a woman, and we couldn't get it. And they said that the Defense of Marriage Act was protective. Well, that was struck down in 2013, at least a major part of it. The rest of it is gone now. But one thing that was proposed at that time by Phyllis Schlafly's Eagle Forum and other groups was to do what Debbie just said, and that is take the jurisdiction over marriage away from the courts, and you could do that through Congress. And there was a lot of talk about doing this, and it never went forward. It didn't happen. And unfortunately, we're now living with the consequences of our naivete over the fact that what just happened today, what was just announced today, could ever happen. I think a lot of people just didn't think it could. But I think there's still a possibility of doing that. And then, Mike Ferris said there's a lot of constitutional changes that could be made if you had a convention. I'm not sure what those are or how that works. And a lot of conservatives really disagree on that. There are two big sides on having a convention of the states. That's a debate to have. But I think there's lots of things that we've got to start thinking about doing now that our backs are against the wall. But the first thing is what do you do with this decision? How do you stand up regarding this decision? I mean, we've got our governor, Greg Abbott, has already issued something very strong about the religious liberty of people and how it will not be infringed. Governors of every state that still has protections for marriage could do this. I don't know if they will.
Yeah, I want to weigh in quickly. I meant my other comment was I would be really careful on this impeachment of judges idea, because that is one especially subject to, well, if we're going to impeach them for doing X, then the liberals going to say, well, and you think the impeachment standard should be somehow mathematical or defined outside of political or cultural viewpoints, but it's very, very hard to do, because I think the Supreme Court would say, if the justices, especially who voted in the majority in all the cases, would say there's nothing unconstitutional. We did exactly right. So for the Congress to say we're going to impeach you, remove you for something you're telling us is constitutional, and you're the one, the Supreme Court justice, that gets pretty hard. I think that's a harder battle. And I do urge listeners on this Convention of the States, I have heard both sides of thinking in the conservative side, but the fear of having a convention because perhaps the left will push its issues or make things worse. We have to decide at what point, if the Constitution isn't being followed anyway, what are you protecting by not having the convention?
Good question.
Good question.
Let's take another phone call real quickly, and I'll carry that over the break. Brian in South Carolina, I think you have a question on the table, so I'd love to hear it.
Okay. Hey, I appreciate it. Thanks for taking my call. The stance that I've taken on this entire issue for many, many years, it's never been popular in conservative circles. I'm a staunch constitutional conservative. I also believe I'm Southern Baptist, by the way. I also believe that marriage is between a man and a woman. I believe that God obviously created the institution of marriage. But see, I just think that government should have they should never have been in the business of marriage from the beginning. I mean, if marriage was created by the church and ultimately by God, that's like states saying who can and cannot partake of the Lord's Supper, or if you're Catholic, it's considered a sacrament. If you're Catholic, marriage is considered a sacrament. But so I think the only way we're going to save the institution of marriage here and prevent pastors from being forced by government to perform same-sex marriages is to say, okay, look, marriage is holy matrimony. That's going to be performed in churches, and you and I both know that, gay people have been going to these liberal and I would say rogue churches for a long time. They tend to be in the big cities, and they've been getting married, and that is fine. I mean, it's not fine with me. I would go to that church, but, that is religious freedom, and it's protected under the First Amendment.
Good. I think you put the point on the table. We'll get back after the break to discuss it. All that coming up right after this.
The Point of View Commentary with Kerby Anderson.
If you've been to a movie recently, you probably were watching a remake or a sequel like Jurassic World or Mad Max. We're in the midst of nearly 30 movies that could be described as remakes or sequels. There are more to come. And don't forget the franchise operations like James Bond, Mission Impossible, X-Men, and Hunger Games. Charlie Jane Anders asks, why does Hollywood keep rebooting the same movie properties over and over again? It's not just because studios want fans of those franchises to be happy. It's because the movie business is about supply and demand. She quotes from Scott Feinberg, who reminds us that the film business, like any other, operates in a market of supply and demand. So while we critics often complain about the supply side, we have to consider the demand. Derek Thompson, writing in The Atlantic, provides a history lesson. He says in 1950, movies were the third largest retail business in America after grocery stores and cars. In the 1950s, 60% of the country went to a cinema each week. That was an audience bigger than today's Super Bowl. Americans used to buy 20 or 30 tickets. Today they buy about 4. Back then, 6 major studios dominated the landscape. They could do basically whatever they wanted and could be sure of making money. They also owned their own theater chains and controlled the means and distribution of their cinematic product. Today, a film producer can no longer guarantee a weekly audience. Thompson concludes that 60 years ago, audiences went to movies reflexively. Now we go to movies mostly to see things we recognize, actors, stories, and crusaders wearing costumes. We're certain to see more of Iron Man, Spider-Man, X-Men, and all the Avengers. I think this opens the door for smaller creative film producers, including Christian film producers, to break out of the mold and tell interesting and inspiring stories that will draw people to the theater or to the DVDs they produce. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, Weekend Edition. Penna, Dexter, Debbie Georgatos with us. And one of the questions that Brian put on the table is one that I've heard before. As a matter of fact, in my book, A Biblical Point of View on Homosexuality, I have a section there because both liberals and conservatives, interesting enough, have suggested every once in a while, maybe we just need to take marriage out of the state, or else take the church out of the marriage business. And in a sense, what Brian is saying is, well, let's just forget about the government. But there, unfortunately, seems to be a compelling interest for the government to be somewhat involved in defining who is married and who is not married, right?
Oh, I think there is. I think the surrendering of the issue by the churches to the government, just saying, well, we're just going to have our little church recognition of what marriage is, and government. You just, as Penna was pointing out during the break, you kind of surrendered the issue. Then the churches are standing back, but the other really big thing is that marriage is intertwined in so many facets of American society, state and federal government, in employment, in insurance, and in divorce laws and child custody laws. There is a recognition of marriage as a man and a woman, and many rights flow, many responsibilities flow because of the existence of that concept. And so, there's just, there's a need for government to have some role in defining what marriage they accept, because what they define as a marriage. And so involved in it. And churches, I think churches' best protection is to say, we in our church, we perform marriages, and we've defined on what basis we perform marriages. And I think most will say it's a man and a woman, and beyond, and these are legal marriages recognized by the state. And we, churches, we're going to stay out of what the state thinks, but we're going to define what we think.
The question is, will they be allowed to do that and retain their tax-exempt status? And that was argued and discussed in the Supreme Court oral arguments over this case. And the Solicitor General, when asked about various cases in which an organization, a church, whatever, could lose their tax-exempt status if they refuse to recognize same-sex marriage. He said that will be an issue. We've talked about that at length here on Point of View. So it's sad. I think the reason why this is such a sad day, one reason is there are certain days in history where everything changes. Like I remember 9/11. I was at the Point of View studio when we heard the news, and I remember thinking, we were just doing all kinds of stories and reporting on it. And I remember thinking things will never be the same. And I was just in an airport yesterday and going through security and all of that, and things are just not the same. Well, Debbie and I don't know if Debbie did this on purpose, but I did. I'm wearing black. We're both wearing black. So if you watch pointofview.net and you see us, you'll see that we are, because things are really going to change. Debbie mentioned that the laws have, there are like thousands of laws that have marriage in them. So a lot is going to start changing now. I think as far as what these laws mean, there'll be changes made in laws, just cosmetic changes. I can see Obama issuing executive orders about just tweaking laws because now gay marriage is the law of the land and all of that. So there's going to be so much change. I don't even think we can anticipate all of it today. And it's very sad. It's sad for the culture. But I think the one thing we do have to do, because the homosexual agenda is used as a weapon against Christians.
Yes.
And now that they have this new affirmation, they're going to even go stronger. Now, the court did, as we mentioned earlier, put in some language in there, and that the justices actually voted on that language and all agreed to it, that religious liberty would be protected. But, we know that's going to be a huge battle going forward. And I think we've got our marching orders. We've got to protect religious liberty. That's the first order of the day. And then, of course, certainly to try to have a movement, a pro-marriage movement, bring marriage back to what God intended it to be. That will be our role as Christians in the culture. It may take years, decades, but we've got to be about that.
Let's take some more phone calls. We'll go to Missouri, KTTK. And Herbert, thank you for calling today.
Yes, sir. Thanks for taking my call. Myself, I am very disappointed. I'm 70 years old, and I've watched my whole life all forms of animal life and foul life, and I have never seen the same sex of anything pair up. And, it's only natural so our Supreme Court, the ones that voted for this, and I don't want to degrade birds, but to refer to them as a bird brain is about right, because the birds got more intelligence than the ruling that they just made.
They ruled against nature.
Well, and a lot of people say, where did this come from? Because I know you were going to ask, and I saw this on the screen there, where does this come from? There's no word homosexuality in the Constitution. And if you read the opinion, and I don't recommend it unless you are having trouble sleeping at night, and then it will take you not long, but it makes
I don't know, you might get so mad you'd stay awake.
But the case that they talk about is the 14th Amendment. They specifically say the 14th Amendment requires a state to license a marriage between two people of the same sex. Then they talk about these various principles. They had 4 principles that they put together, and one of those was this idea of equal protection. Now, the thing I did not know is the 14th Amendment was actually written so that it would provide equal protection to African Americans. But what I did not know is that these authors of this actually had in the back of their mind homosexual marriage back in the 19th century. I did not know that. And that shows you, I'm making you laugh, but you're a Georgetown graduate. You went to law school. I went to government school there at Georgetown, but we didn't even have it taught that way when we were there from our liberal professors, did we? This is pretty bizarre stuff.
It is very bizarre stuff. I would like to make one really clear equal protection argument. There already was equal protection with respect to marriage before this decision. Every single person had the right to marry someone of the opposite sex. That's a legitimate equal protection interpretation. Mm-hmm. But seriously, to your point, obviously the equal protection clause, or the 14th Amendment and the Equal Protection Clause, which is in the first part of that amendment, was surrounding slavery. It didn't have anything to do with the perversion of the institution of marriage. It's a big stretch to call it, to use it that way.
Yeah, well, and again, that's how you have seen over the last 2 days now. We haven't spent much time yet talking about the subsidies. We'll get to that in just a few minutes, because that is they just, either they would say in the state a case yesterday that it says state exchanges, but that really doesn't mean state exchanges. It means federal exchanges and state exchanges. Well, that's not what it says. And so Justice Roberts twisted it this way. And in this case, Justice Kennedy twisted it to say equal protection, which really was something that would guarantee equal protection for those African Americans who had been slaves, is now going to be perverted in such a way to apply to all individuals that want to marry someone of the same sex. And the 14th Amendment also requires, this is their quote, states to recognize same-sex marriages validly performed out of state. So that says, even though in the state of Texas you did not recognize those people who were having a same-sex marriage in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, if they move here, now you have to grant them the same rights, even though they were not married in your state and you did not recognize them when they moved to your state.
Yeah. If we're going to jump to the Burwell decision, which relates to Obamacare, I want to just say one more thing before we get on to that, which has to do with advocacy on the conservative side concerning marriage. One of the reasons that the left, I think, has been successful in convincing Americans that we ought to accord same-sex marriage equal protection status is the idea that essentially, what's the harm? Who are you as a married traditional couple? How are you harmed by as somebody else in your community being in a same-sex marriage? And I think there has not been a really clear and well thought out response, at least consistently. And one very simple point that I think is important to make, there are now children who are raised in families with same-sex parent families. There are books being written, there are articles being written that talk about, regardless of what the left tries to tell you about same-sex marriage, it is not healthy. When I was growing up with two moms, I really missed a dad. I wish I'd had a dad. We need to use the emotion and the factual arguments like the left does to sell our case on the importance of recognizing, yes, there is a consequence beyond just the marriage of two people who, are in the same sex. There's a consequence to families, to children, to the culture and the community.
There was a very powerful brief filed in this case, Obergefell versus Hodges, from people who had been raised in same-sex homes. I had one of them on the program who also wrote a book about her life with two dads, and she's from Canada. She lives in Canada now, and she has talked about what it's done to religious liberty in Canada. She issued a warning. It was powerful, but I guess not powerful enough to sway them.
And you were asking how to respond. Ryan Anderson does a really good job. Yeah. Here's how to respond. And he's got a new book coming out. So, Penna, you and I maybe should do an interview on the new book, Truth Overruled, The Future of Marriage and Religious Freedom. Of course, his earlier book that he wrote with Professor Robert George, who I just mentioned a minute ago, and some others, certainly is a good book. And there's some people that are formulating that. But oftentimes the question is, how does my homosexual marriage affect your marriage? That's not the question. How does the redefinition of marriage affect all marriages? And we know what happens when that happens. And certainly that's the case. One of our callers wants to talk about, well, if indeed they've redefined marriage, what word will they redefine next? We've got transsexual and transracial, and we've got same-sex marriage. I'm not sure words have any meaning. And I believe that that's what Justice Scalia said yesterday in that case. We'll come back and talk about that briefly, and then we'll hear from Tony Perkins. A lot more coming up right after this.
When you hear about a child forced into the sex trade, it should make your blood boil. Someone needs to do something. Noel Boucher became that someone, leading a ministry called Pure Hope, promoting sexual purity and fighting sex trafficking. And it all began as his parents listened to Point of View.
Even when I was a young child, and even when that content was almost in the background, definitely shaped how I thought about my faith and what the Lord expected of me and the community that He would provide around me.
Kerby has met numerous young people in recent days who are on the front lines of the faith because God uses Point of View. Your support today will raise up another generation to impact lives. Listen, right now, every dollar you give will be matched, doubled. Please give online at pointofview.net. pointofview.net, or mail your donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221, or call 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
Many times, people who are older than me say they have given up hope on America. They don't believe that we can come back from the changes and challenges. The widespread promotion of anti-Christian beliefs is sweeping into courtrooms, schools, newsrooms, and homes. They are pushing to be mainstream and claiming the Bible and Christian beliefs are a thing of the past, or worse, bigoted. It is easy for the older generation to give up when America is so different now from the one they grew up with. But if you give up, where does that leave my generation and the ones behind me? I believe that we should stand and pray. The only one who can fix us and make America a shining light again is God. He promised his plans are to prosper his people and give us a hope and a future. Prayer is the best way we can act on the hope for a future. James wrote, "The fervent prayer of a righteous man avails much." I still believe that. If you believe God will shape the future by the prayers of his people, you can sign up to be a part of the Pray for America campaign at pointofview.net/pray.
In my childhood, pre-internet, the radio played a fairly large role. I remember hearing Point of View come on the radio and Marlon Maddox and the introduction to global perspectives on what God and his people are doing throughout the earth. Even when I was a young child, and even when that content was almost in the background of family life or of commuting or being dropped off at sporting activities, there was a sense, and it created a sense within me, that there were people in the world who were leading well, following Jesus, communicating the gospel, and applying that to our lives and our cultural experiences. And I think that that impact definitely shaped how I thought about my faith, even as a child, and what the Lord expected of me and the community that he would provide around me to fulfill the purposes for my life. All of us need understanding. Scripture says, seek, gain, look for, apply understanding in our lives. And really, understanding is about understanding a narrative, a story, especially in the 21st century where we have so many stories, so much information, so many competing narratives coming against us. We have to understand God's narrative and our role in that. And of course, Christian radio, and specifically Point of View, is touching thousands and millions of lives across the world and equipping people to walk in that worldview.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Weekend edition, Penna, Dexter, and Debbie Georgatos. Just before we get back probably to the decision of the day, I did want to spend at least a little bit of time talking about the decision from yesterday. And I said there were a couple of things. First of all, that was a political decision, not a judicial decision. It seems to me that Chief Justice John Roberts just did not want to be labeled as the justice that ended or caused problems for the Affordable Care Act. But also, Justice Scalia said basically what we have now as a legislature. He said we should really start calling the law SCOTUS care. I love that one. And one more point, and I'll get some of your comments. It gets back to one of our callers wanted to talk about this. Words have no fixed meaning, and it's kind of like the argument made yesterday is, well, this word exchange, state exchange, it's a little bit ambiguous. So even though it says state exchange, it really means state and federal exchange. And I had fun yesterday saying, well, then we could say all sorts of laws are ambiguous, and that means I can redefine them. As a matter of fact, if you think about it, you could maybe say the 10 Commandments are a little bit ambiguous. And
the 10 suggestions.
Yeah, 10 suggestions. So, Penna, what about this? It seems to me that this decision yesterday was a source of real concern as well, and it did not bode well for what we saw happening today.
No, it didn't. It basically showed that our Supreme Court has become unmoored from its real reason for being and its practical usage in the country, and they become a legislative body. And John Roberts has taken it upon himself to write 2 opinions that have really twisted things and defended President Obama's signature legislation. And we could all speculate why he's done that. We thought he was a conservative, and today, you can see the conservative parts of him coming out in that decision that was announced today, but it certainly wasn't the case with the Burwell decision. And so, I guess just to explain, in case people weren't familiar with the nuances of it, it has to do with the subsidies for Obamacare. When you sign up for Obamacare, it's pretty expensive. And so a lot of folks that sign up can't afford it, and they get subsidies, and the federal government provides the subsidies, but only, according to the law, we thought, to people living in states that have established exchanges. And that's only about 16 states or so, I think. So the rest of the states were not supposed to get subsidies, but the IRS came out and wrote a rule that said all states, all people that sign up for Obamacare that can't afford it will get the subsidies. And so that was challenged, and it went all the way to the Supreme Court. The court yesterday announced its ruling that the subsidies will go to anyone living in any state, that the phrase established by the state, that these exchanges were supposed to be established by the state, really meant, I guess, established by the state and federal government. I don't know.
Just had to add words.
Yeah,
in there
just
to
adding words.
Yeah.
They shunned the plain meaning of the words established by the state, redefined it. So, basically he let, and I think Roberts, in a sense, just doesn't like to change what Obama did with Obamacare. And he finds ways, however convoluted they are, he finds ways to do it. So now we have Obamacare. I think what it does is point up the need to repeal Obamacare, root and branch.
I agree with that. It's interesting in the in law school, they teach you about how Supreme Court justices or federal appellate courts, making decisions are supposed to analyze things. And to start with, you always, the primary basis is the plain meaning of the language. I actually thought that even, and I'm a little bit cynical about courts, and I still thought the Supreme Court would have to strike down the subsidies, and Penna did a great job describing the law, but strike down subsidies being paid to states where there is no state exchange. There is just, the law is black and white clear. But even if you thought somehow that state exchanges maybe had some fuzzy meaning, the next way that courts are supposed to analyze cases in front of it is to look at the legislative intent, and they have a list of factors in legislative intent, including, the words, previous drafts, the comments by people who are working on the legislation. And there is, in this particular case, Jonathan Gruber, who was a architect of Obamacare, is on tape all over YouTube. You can see, I think it's like 15 times, making public statements essentially saying the language in Obamacare was written to force states to agree to create exchanges because otherwise the citizens in those states could not get subsidies. It was clear as a bell. The law was written clearly, and the legislative intent could lead to no other conclusion than that it was intended to be to force the states to create exchanges. The Congress never, or the Democrats never anticipated that many courts would just refuse to do it. That many states would refuse to do it. So where we are is that the Supreme Court has said we've lost the rule of law. We don't follow the law. This is the kind of a political arm, the legislative arm. We're just deciding what looks best and sounds best. It was a true, even if you love Obamacare or you hate Obamacare, it is a true signal that the court is completely willing to surrender their job as interpreters following the law and the Constitution, and to interpret the law and not to make it. They abandoned their role.
What about the word humility? It seems to me that yesterday the court could have said, you didn't define it well, it's ambiguous, so you need to solve that. And there have been times in the courts,
yes.
And yesterday Dr. Merrill Matthews pointed out a couple of times where Justice Scalia and others have said, this was unclear in the law, it's not our job to fix it, you need to fix it. But they didn't do that. Today you could say, it would have been possible for them to say, it's not our role to define marriage. We'll let this play out in the states. In both cases, they said, well, because there's a little bit of a confusion here, we'll just step in, we'll become the super legislature and deal with that. That's not exactly the way we were taught in law school or in government class on how the Supreme Court was supposed to function.
Exactly right. And one more point on the Obamacare case. The problem when you have benefits, it's a political problem for people in Congress. If you've created a right or a benefit and you have people become dependent on it, part of the inherent calculation is just going to happen. If you're a member of the U.S. Congress and you're talking about cutting welfare, you're talking about, making change to government assistance programs, it's inevitable you're going to consider how many people are relying on this. What do we do with the people in the pipeline? What do we do with the people currently relying? How do we change that? It's a complex problem. And that that reality did not escape the consideration of the Supreme Court, looking at all the people who the numbers were out there relying on Obamacare and getting money or living in states that didn't have an exchange. I just think there's that kind of human factor that says, well, I don't want to be the one to take their benefit away, even though that's not their job to decide. That it should be irrelevant to their consideration.
Let's see if we can take a few phone calls. Some people asking where this leads next. So we'll head out to California first. KNLB. Thomas, thank you for calling today.
Yeah, the whole thing that the Supreme Court has done, I think they have kicked the door open for people who practice polygamy to sue the Marriage Bureau license, because you can't recognize gay marriage and not say people who practice polygamy can't have their marriage recognized with a marriage license.
You got it. I mean, this has been an argument that's made in every one of these cases about homosexual rights, that, where do you draw the line? And, if you can't draw the line as to what genders are part of marriage, then how can you draw the line as to what numbers?
Let's take another phone call, kind of similar, in Missouri, KNEO. Joyce, I think you had something similar, so go for it.
Yes, my question was on the equal protection. Who is to say that a man or a woman couldn't marry umpteen dozen of the same sex? Or if you want to carry it even farther, if they want to marry children, or carry it even farther, what about if you want to marry your pet?
Yeah. Well, and the easy one is, first of all, polygamy. And I've said before, and I think you can make a pretty good case, every argument for same-sex marriage is pretty much an argument for polygamy. And then really every argument for polygamy is pretty much an argument for polyamory. In other words, if people of different situations.
Two men and one woman, or three men and two women, all in one marriage.
Bizarre things.
Or one relationship.
You just don't stop at two, right? I mean, once you redefine marriage, nobody's come up with a definition that causes us to stop at that point. I mean, it was pretty easy biologically, say one man and one woman. Once you redefine it, nobody's come up with an alternative definition. And of course, we know that some people in the homosexual community actually just want to destroy the institution of marriage. I've read those quotes on the air many, many times before, and we'll read them again in case anybody doubts them. And they've been very honest about the fact that they're really not wanting their marriage. They just really don't want anything. They want a change in the laws so that number, gender, all of that are up to your own individual choices.
In the Scandinavian countries and the Netherlands, they were some of the early same-sex marriage and civil unions countries, marriage has fallen off precipitously. And I think, maybe America could be different in one sense, that we are so individualistic that people will actually rebel by getting married more. Let's hope so.
I do feel concerned about that. There is there's no principled basis to confine marriage. Once you say it's something beyond one man, one woman, there's no principle articulated that could ever stop the expansion of it. And really, I go back a lot to children. I just think our country has done a beautiful job demonstrating, and most of Western culture demonstrating the beauty of traditional marriage and on children.
We'll take a break. We'll be back with more right after this.
The Wall Street Journal reports on the fact that the 5 largest commercial health insurers in the U.S. are pursuing various combinations of mergers and or purchases of one another. In an editorial, the Journal expresses concern about the possibility of all 5 fusing into one monster conglomerate. They call this an oligopoly. The Journal explains the phenomenon, saying the economics of Obamacare rewards scale over competition. Standardized benefits and premiums have compressed profit margins for insurance companies. There are few possibilities under this system to offer more products to attract customers. These mergers and acquisitions are, in effect, attempts to buy more customers. Merging will also allow these companies to combine administrative overhead and other expenses with the goal of gaining efficiencies to improve their profit pictures. But why is there this increased standardization of the policies and benefits offered by health insurance companies? It's because their main customer is increasingly the federal government. There's Medicaid managed care, Medicare Advantage, and of course the Obamacare exchanges themselves. The Journal explains that when most of what these insurance companies do is geared to please this one major customer, the federal government, it, quote, may well be that only fewer, larger, more centralized insurers can survive financially. There's another consolidation frenzy. Hospitals, doctors, and other providers are also uniting. Again, quoting the Wall Street Journal, hospital mergers have climbed every year since 2009. And hospitals are absorbing physician groups, with doctors increasingly becoming salaried workers at hospitals. Regional hospital megasystems are beginning to dominate certain markets. This is turning out to be more about maximizing revenues than increasing efficiency and improving outcomes. The Journal admits that healthcare has been consolidating since the 90s, but under current law the trend has accelerated. The good news is technological and biological discoveries continue at a rapid pace. But without a healthy set of companies with the incentive to finance and deliver these new products into the system and to patients, this innovation will fall off. Small, hungry companies with optimistic investors would find profitable ways to get new and better healthcare to patients and make a profit doing it. But conglomerates, largely dependent on one client, the federal government, will act in risk-averse ways to protect their bottom lines. Here's the Journal's ominous conclusion. 5 years into the glories of healthcare reform, the same antiquated incumbents dominate as they did before, only with less accountability to patients. It remains to be seen what kind of blow the Supreme Court's ruling regarding federal subsidies will deal to the healthcare system. But we ought to use this opportunity to create something that employs state innovation and free markets before we devolve into a single healthcare behemoth controlled by the federal government. It's really now or never. For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. It's our weekend edition. Penna Dexter and Debbie Georgatos. And Penna, we have our friend Tony Perkins with us as well.
Tony Perkins is president of Family Research Council. Tony, thanks for joining us on this, momentous day.
Good afternoon. Yes, it is a significant day. I think it's a day that will mark a turning point in American history, and not for the better. Although it's not the final chapter, it's certainly a wake-up call to Christians in this country and to those who care about freedom, that those freedoms are now hanging in the balance of this court decision that really usurped not only the authority of the states, but more importantly of the voters in those states to self-govern and to determine the future of this country.
Tony, it's a terrible decision for religious liberty also, isn't it?
Absolutely. Because what the court has said is that this institution that began with the beginning of man, rooted deeply in Orthodox religious teachings, including Christianity, that the court can overturn that. Now, certainly the court can change laws, but they can't change reality, nor do they have the moral authority to redefine not only what all of human history records as the standard and as the norm, but what Jesus himself specifically stated in the Gospels as what marriage is.
You know, Tony, one of the things that we are certainly wanting people to do is we have our Pray for America campaign. I might mention that you're going to be speaking at First Baptist Church in Dallas, but also this Sunday is Call to Fall. And as we talk about solutions, and we have certainly had some conversation with people like Gary Bauer and Michael Ferris, some political solutions, I know you also want to address this issue of the importance of prayer right now.
Without a question. I mean, we're seeing, Kerby, that this is not a political issue. It is really at its heart a spiritual issue, and we've seen this this attack on marriage this is 50 years in the making. We've now come to what I think may be the final attack on marriage, because we're redefining it potentially out of existence. But here's the hope of Christians, and we're never, I was just sharing with my team earlier today, like, we're never without hope. We might be pressed down, we might be, discouraged, but we're not crushed. We're never to give up, because we have hope that springs eternal, and we have power that transcends the wisdom of man and man's political institutions, and that is found in God himself. This is God's institution. God created marriage. God cares about it. In fact, cares about it so much it's the parallel, the illustration, the analogy that he uses between the relationship between his son Jesus Christ and the believers, the church, a marriage analogy. And so I think as we appeal to him, as we stand for truth, unyielding to the cultural forces, there is the chance, and I'm optimistic, that we will see some turn, potentially repentance, revival in our nation. It's certainly what we need, we must have, and that begins in prayer. And that's why this Sunday, as you pointed out, is a call to fall, and we're asking churches across the nation to spend just maybe 5 minutes on their knees in prayer for our nation. And I can't imagine we could have any greater impetus to do that than what has been handed down by the court today.
I might just mention that there are some places people can find you at Family Research Council. And Penna, I know you have another comment.
Well, Tony, I also want to ask about, because we're tempted to give up and just say, well, the court settled it. I think a lot of people would say that. But that is absolutely not what a believer should do. As you mentioned, we have the power of the Holy Spirit within us, number one. And there's also been some strategizing done because this was sort of expected. So, for instance, I see your press release today that the decision will not be accepted. So how do we not accept it?
Well, again, the court has no moral authority to redefine an institution that they did not create. And it's not a legitimate act of the court to redefine marriage, just as it was not a legitimate act of the court in 1973 to say a mother could, for any reason at any time in the 9 months of pregnancy, take the life of their unborn child. The American people did not accept that as legitimate and valid. And 42 years later, we have seen that. The court thought they were going, or stated they were going to solve the issue of abortion. They have not. It's an issue in every election from president on down. This will continue to be an issue, and we must just, look, is there going to be pressure? Absolutely. Is government going to try to pressure people? Is it going to use this leverage to force people to jettison their biblical view of marriage? Without a doubt. But this is really a time where we choose. It's one of those Acts 4 moments where we have to ask the question, do we obey God or man? Because man's law today in this country was put in direct contradiction to the law of God.
Another thought I wanted to share as we talk about our Christians around the country praying about all this is that it's one thing I think it can sound to, if you're harsh, think, well, the Christians are just praying against homosexuals and praying in favor of their own view and against somebody else. But really, there's a beautiful idea in Christianity about praying to uplift everyone. You're trying to lift people out of the darkness, confusion, and just not just unhealthy lifestyle, but unholy lifestyle. It's a prayer is a positive thing to uplift people. It's not a condemnation thing. And I think when we can message like that, people are attracted to that message.
Without a question. I mean, Jesus himself said that I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man comes to the Father but by me. What this is essentially about is an effort to silence the truth. Now, it happens to be on the issue of human sexuality and marriage, but that's a key component of who we are. The Scriptures. That's why the Scriptures speak so much about human sexuality and where it's appropriate and where it's not. It is a clearly a time for us to stand and speak the truth, not to win a debate or to prevail in an argument, but rather, as you've pointed out, so that people can come to know the truth and experience the abundant life that comes only through Jesus Christ. And that requires first repentance, turning from our sin, regardless of what that sin may be, and embracing His standard. And His standard on this is without question. Jesus Himself in Matthew 19 said, "Have you not read from the beginning that God created them male and female? For that reason, a man will leave his mother and father and cling to his wife, and the two will become one flesh." In that one passage, those two verses, Jesus spoke about gender. There are only two, and He spoke about what marriage is. It's the union of a man and a woman. And as a follower of Jesus Christ, we cannot apologize for that. We cannot back away from it. If we're truly going to follow Him, we have to follow what He said, and that is clearly what He said.
Tony Perkins, president of the Family Research Council. We have a link to his website, frc.org. They have some suggested tweets that you could send out to actually encourage a discussion. And most importantly, we do once again remind you that this Sunday, Call to Fall, you can find all of that information on our website. And for those of you in the Dallas area, you might come to First Baptist Church and get a chance to hear and to meet Tony Perkins. So, Tony, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you all, and have a blessed afternoon.
Well, we certainly appreciate you joining with us. Penna and Debbie, we only have a minute, but any final comments about this day?
Well, I would say, because I thought about this before, I was pretty depressed about the decision and the changes. And then I thought, well, you know, God's still in control. He sits on the throne. He's seated at the right hand of God. I am a follower of His. I have eternal life and that joy. And so, you know, I may focus on that this weekend. And I hope listeners do too.
I just had the simple thought that we're never promised a perfect earthly life. There are always strives, there are always striving, there are always challenges. The question is how you answer it. Do you step up and stand up for what you believe in and keep on saying it regardless of the times you stumble and fall or there's a roadblock in your way? And so we have the truth on our side. And so that's the most powerful thing to have.
Well, I hope you have a great weekend. Next week, we have some experts in here to do a little more analysis of some of these very important issues, but we're simply out of time today. So I want to thank Andrew, Catherine, and Chris for their help behind the scenes. Visit our website, pointofview.net. We need to hear from you before the end of our fiscal year. We'll be back on Monday.
Noel Boucher rescues people. The ministry he leads, Pure Hope, reaches those trapped in sex trafficking and helps set them free. Noel has listened to Point of View since he was a child, and that enables him to cut through the competing stories that try to give meaning to our times and to see God's story for his own life.
We have to understand God's narrative and our role in that. And of course, Christian radio, and specifically Point of View, is touching thousands and millions of lives across the world and equipping people to walk in that worldview.
Your gift to Point of View can make an impact for generations. And hear this, we all want to give generously. And right now, at the end of our fiscal year, no matter what your gift, $25 or $5,000, it will be doubled by a generous matching gift from ministry friends. So give now, online at pointofview.net. Pointofview.net. Mail your donation to Point of View, Box 30. Dallas, Texas 75221, or call 800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.